I'm joined by Dorothy Parvaz. She's an Iranian journalist and global politics reporter at Think Progress. So let's talk about this court ruling. How significant is this, and is it really a victory for Iran?
Well, it's certainly a moral victory, but is it a legal victory in that it's enforceable by, the international court? No. And the U.S. response has basically been a defiant one that proves that.
So what options does Iran have if it cannot be enforced? Where do they go from here?
Well, I mean, legal avenues, what they can do is try to make the nuclear deal work with the remaining partners in it. And if that doesn't work out, they have mechanisms to leave the deal. But that's it. They can't really do anything else.
And so the U.S., as you said, responded by pulling out of this treaty from 1955. What do you think the United States is trying to accomplish by doing that?
Well, it's two things. One is sort of just to let Iran know that it doesn't really care what the international community thinks at all, as we learned at the UN last week. And the other is to sort of stick with the script that the Trump administration has been going with so far, which is that they're not really bound by any international sort of authority. So they've already expressed disdain for the International Criminal Court. This is now the International Court of Justice. They've pulled out of a lot of international bodies at the UN already.
And we're seeing this as just one step in a long progression of tit for tat between these two countries. Now we see coming up in November additional sanctions by the United States on Iran. What do you think happens between now and then? And are relations between these two countries the lowest they've ever been? I mean, where do they go from here?
I mean, it's hard to imagine them being worse. Maybe perhaps the 1979 hostage crisis in Iran was probably the worst it's been. But, this is largely going to serve probably to isolate the U.S. more with its allies. So its allies in the EU, its trade allies, its ally China, who has already said it's going to continue buying oil from Iran. So this is not going to bode well for the U.S. when it comes to how it negotiates with its friends, security-wise and trade-wise.
Right, because when the international community watches how this has played out as of late, I mean, the perception is it par for the course? I mean, the United States has been doing many things in the last few months unilaterally, self-isolating, some would say, not just politically, but economically.
Sure, but the thing is, the rest of the world is still, they're members of bodies that work together. So the UN is where everybody gets together and tries to address some of the world's biggest problems, the refugee compact, so on and so forth. So when the United States, when our president leads a UN Security Council meeting, lambasting Iran and justifying that as reasons to pull out of the nuclear deal, and one member state after the other at the Security Council, all 14 other states, none of whom thought the deal was perfect, basically said, no, you were wrong to leave this deal, and it was a step in the right direction. If that's not being isolated, it's hard to imagine what is.
And John Bolton has come out. He says that the United States is not after regime change in Iran. What do you make of that, and do you think anyone believes what he says when the U.S. is not after regime change?
Well, I mean, certainly that's been the line of late at the Trump administration, that they're not after regime change. But the fact is, if you looked at the biggest group of protesters outside the UN, they're a group of Iranians affiliated with the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq group, and they're the ones who pay people like Bolton and Giuliani to speak, and they're the ones shouting for regime change. So if he's not for regime change, then perhaps he shouldn't accept money from these groups, and then maybe his message that they're not seeking regime change would seem a little less muddied.
And the one piece in all of this latest development is lifting of sanctions on humanitarian goods. Mm-hmm. Where do you think that goes from here?
Well, I mean, that's a tricky one, but the U.S. basically does have indeed sanctions exemptions for these things. But the problem is that a lot of companies feel skittish about it. So even if the exemptions are there, the net effect is that they don't really work. Like, Iran makes over 95% of its own pharmaceuticals, but it imports over 50% of the raw materials it needs for that. And if you look at the drug shortages happening in Iran right now, it's obvious that these exemptions aren't really working as they're intended. So why not change them? If the exemptions are there, make them effective.
We'll just have to see where it goes from here. Dorothy Parvaz, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.